Welcome everyone. We'll wait just a second for everyone to get situated and then we'll start our webinar. Great, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Climate Equity and Corporate Renewable Energy Procurement, linking high impact procurement to energy development needs in Africa. My name is Oren Cook, Innovative Finance and Asia Program Lead with Energy Peace Partners, co-host of today's webinar alongside Sustainable Energy for All. I'm thrilled to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers who all come to today's discussion from different backgrounds and with different approaches to addressing climate equity through renewable energy. Our panelists today include Olivia Caldry, Head of Energy Finance and Clean Cooking at SE for All, Joan Chihinza, Director, Energy Access Financial Advisory at African Mini Grid Developers Association, Sherwin Das, Managing Director of Energy Peace Partners, and Vanessa Meiler-Fels, Director of Energy Innovation and Impact at Microsoft. Before we get started, just a few logistical notes. While we do have presentations from our speakers to get started, we would like this to be an interactive discussion. So please do make use of the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask questions. Panelists will be able to answer these questions directly in the Q&A feature, or we can surface them following the conclusion of the panelist presentations. Finally, we will be recording today's meeting and hope to make that available in the coming days. So let's get started with our discussion. Today, we will hear about climate equity in the context of energy access, renewable energy financing, and explore the ways in which corporate renewable energy solutions can help unlock new project development in the world's most fragile and least electrified regions. Climate equity is a term that comes from the recognition that climate change poses the greatest threat to those who are least responsible for it, including low-income, disadvantaged populations and marginalized communities. At the same time, those who have contributed the most to climate change have a greater ability to adapt to and protect themselves from its impacts. As the effects of climate change grow, we need to ensure that climate solutions reach those most vulnerable to these impacts. I'm personally thrilled to take part in today's webinar, as it's a topic near and dear to the work we do at Energy Peace Partners. For those of you who may not be familiar, Energy Peace Partners is a nonprofit based in California and Nairobi that works at the intersection of renewable energy, climate security, and peace building. Our unique team of experts across these areas works to extend the promise of renewable energy to regions that are conflict affected, energy poor, and climate vulnerable. Our primary innovation, the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, or PREC, links emerging global corporate demand for renewable energy solutions with new high-impact projects in areas that otherwise struggle to attract investment and climate finance. And this trend of corporate renewable energy procurement is really quite a remarkable development. Over the last 5 years, we've seen an exponential growth of corporate renewable energy and climate commitments. For example, through the RE100 campaign, over 320 corporates have now voluntarily made 100% renewable energy commitments for their global operations, totaling over 330 million megawatt hours of renewable energy and representing billions of dollars of new investment to support the global clean energy transition. Through our discussion today, we hope to highlight that the buying power and commitments of corporations can, alongside other financing mechanisms, help extend the renewable energy revolution to some of the world's most vulnerable communities. As you'll hear from Olivia, almost 800 million people around the world lack access to electricity, 80% of whom live in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Unlike the US and Europe, many countries in these regions lack developed grid infrastructure. As Joan will highlight, many project developers in Africa encounter high project financing hurdles and face logistical challenges in sourcing, delivering, constructing, and maintaining new renewable energy projects. The situation is even more difficult in fragile states. The uncertainty of their political and economic environments deters investment and severely limits access to finance. Sherwin will explain how Energy Peace Partners believes renewable energy procurement instruments used by corporations can be leveraged as critical de-risking mechanisms and catalytic revenue sources for renewable energy developers to secure project financing in those locations where financing is most challenging. Indeed, for corporations who want to support projects in these regions, the pathway is not always straightforward. Renewable energy accounting frameworks, the rules by which corporations can make renewable energy usage claims, were designed to support procurement from grid-connected systems. However, electricity market realities encountered in many of the world's least electrified countries are markedly different than in developed markets. Centralized electricity grids are often not reliable or present, and decentralized off-grid solutions instead can provide a viable path forward. As you'll hear from Vanessa, Microsoft has recently begun to incorporate high-impact procurement from mini grids in Africa into their portfolio and are making industry-leading climate and climate equity commitments. So with that, I will turn it over to our co-host, Sustainable Energy for All, and our first speaker, Olivia Caldry. Olivia?
Thanks very much, Oren. Hi, everyone. It's fantastic to have you with us today. On behalf of Sustainable Energy for All, I'd like to share my warm welcome. Thank you for your interest. Promises to be a fascinating discussion. And we're really at the cutting edge of financial innovation for one of our biggest challenges, which is getting electricity access, in particular to people in sub-Saharan Africa who currently don't have it. So my job today is to set the scene and just remind us of the electricity access challenge in sub-Saharan Africa and turn our minds to the money question and how we're going to finance Sustainable Development Goal 7 and related SDGs and help us achieve universal access. Hopefully that sets the scene nicely for the remaining panelists. So let's get underway. Super excited to have you with us. So just taking a step back, a reminder that SDG 7, affordable, clean, reliable energy, really sits at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's one thing to deliver electricity access, but let's think about all the co-benefits that arise from it and everything that good electricity and energy access can do. So for example, electricity access to schools and clinics is going to go a long way in helping us achieve SDGs 3 and 4, on health and well-being for everyone and good quality education. Women are particularly affected by energy access or lack of it. They spend a lot of their days in many parts of the world collecting fuel for heating and cooking, for example. Good energy service to women in particular can help free up their time for much more productive economic activity outside the home. Obviously, good electricity service is fundamental to economic growth, ranging from small SMEs right through to large-scale industry, SDGs 8 and 9. It's also closely associated with the transition from traditional sources of fuel, for example, fossil fuels, to cleaner alternatives, which are going to go a long way to helping us achieve our climate action commitments on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and SDG 15, good life on land, and arresting deforestation. So SDG 7 really at the centre of the SDG challenge for all of us. So let's take a look at the electricity access challenge in particular. So these numbers on the slide are from this year's Tracking SDG 7 report, which a lot of you will be familiar with. What it's telling us is that about 750 million people globally live without electricity in 2019, which is the year for which data is most recently available. That's just the electricity access challenge. If we think about the other dimensions of SDG 7, clean cooking in particular, that number goes into the billions. But let's focus today on electricity. What we can also say is that this challenge is concentrated in a group of countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. So 23 countries in the world make up 80% of the electricity access challenge. 18 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. What's troubling and worth noting at this point is that most of the gains we've made in helping achieve electricity access globally over the past few years have actually been in Asia. And what we're seeing is that as soon as we sort of roll electricity access out in Africa, it's not necessarily keeping up with population growth. So the average annual growth rate in people without electricity access in Africa is actually increasing. So let's go to the next level on this. What we can see here is that in a significant number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, of those 18, there has really been very little material change in access rates over the last 10 years. So if we look at the period 2010 to 2019, and the bottom left-hand side of this chart, we can see that there's a significant number of countries there that really haven't moved much at all in their electricity access rates. So I'm looking in particular at Chad, Malawi, Niger, South Sudan. It's really been 5% or less rate of change or rate of improvement in electricity access over the last decade. What that tells us is that on a business as usual trajectory, we're still going to see 700 million people or so estimated to be unelectrified in Africa in 2030. So as a reminder, that's the year when we're trying to hit our SDG 7 targets of universal electrification. In a business as usual scenario, we're a long way away from that, and we're still going to see almost 700 million people without electricity in Africa. So what that's telling us from a pure access point of view, and particularly from a financing point of view, is we need to do things differently because business as usual approaches aren't getting us to where we need to be quickly enough. So let's have a look at the money question then. So these numbers and charts are from the IEA, which runs a bunch of scenarios that project the amount of investment required to reach universal energy access. The Sustainable Development Scenario, which many of you will be familiar with, is an attempt to project the investment required to achieve 3 SDGs in particular. So SDG 7 on energy, SDG 3 on good health and well-being, and SDG 13 on climate action. So the Sustainable Development Scenario tells us that, well over $1 trillion a year is going to be required, and that's a year up to 2030 is going to be required to get us to Sustainable Development Scenario projections. And of that, about 35 billion a year is going to have to be earmarked just to get to universal access, let alone the transition to renewable generations. So that's the sort of figure we're looking at for universal electricity access and energy access. And if we sort of add to that the transition scenarios and SDGs 3 and 13, we're looking at well over $1 trillion a year in investment. Let's be a little bit more granular. At SE4All, we run a research series called Energising Finance, which we've been doing for a number of years now. What that does is track finance commitments for energy access in the countries with the large access deficits. So the countries you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide will be familiar from the slide a few earlier in the presentation. So these are the countries in Africa and Asia with the largest electricity access deficits. And most of those, again, are in sub-Saharan Africa. What the red icons on this slide are telling us is the proportion of each country's population without access to electricity. So just jumping straight to the bottom of the chart, Chad, for example, has 88% of its population without electricity access. What this also tells us is that of the finance commitments that we've tracked for electricity, they're very highly concentrated in a small number of countries. So in 2018, for example, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Tanzania received the lion's share of finance commitments for electricity, whereas there's a very, very long tail, mostly sub-Saharan African countries, that saw very little finance committed to addressing the electricity access problem. So in Chad, for example, again, we couldn't find a single dollar of public or private finance that went to Chad's electricity sector in 2018. And that was despite sort of a very comprehensive tracking process and methodology that we use. Similarly, in countries like the Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger, significant electricity access challenges in those countries, but amounts in the tens of millions of dollars flowing to address the problem. So we have a really big problem, and again, a sign that business as usual needs to change if we're going to get to our SDG 7 electrification targets. Just in the last couple of slides, I'll wrap up with just an overview of where this money is coming from. So in 2018, to all of those 20 countries with the largest electricity access deficits, we tracked around $43 billion in finance from all sources. So that's banks, export credit agencies, development finance institutions, national institutions, and so on, and corporates themselves. The bulk of the money is coming from project sponsors and corporates, with significant chunks being allocated from development finance institutions. What we're not seeing year on year, and we've been doing this tracking since 2013, is a lot of money coming from the corporate finance sector in the form of banks and other financial institutions. And implicitly what that's telling us is those institutions see these geographies as risky, they're high risk, some conflict zones still. These are markets that are difficult or perceived as difficult, that commercial finance is reluctant to enter into. And that's been the case for year on year now, from 2013 right up to the present. What these numbers are also telling us is that of that same $43 billion figure, still the very, very vast majority of finance is committed to grid-connected projects. Quite alarmingly, still a number of fossil fuel projects, as also renewables projects. Again, what we're not seeing year on year since 2013 is significant investment in off-grid solutions. So many people on this call will know that off-grid energy solutions are the quickest, cheapest, most effective way of getting electricity access to populations that need it, particularly in rural and remote areas. What we're not seeing is investment going into that sector. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's provided a brief overview of the electricity access problem in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in Africa, and the finance challenge that accompanies it. And that sets the scene for the panel discussion to follow. So Oren, back to you.
Great, thank you, Olivia. Very much appreciated in helping us set the scene on energy access globally. And I think we'll turn it over to Joan Chahenza from African Mini Grid Developers Association to give us a very specific Africa perspective. And Joan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Oren. It was an absolute pleasure listening to the C4All global perspective. So I will give a more nuanced approach to the Africa market and more specifically to the mini grid development in Africa. And before I begin, I just want to say that I'm very excited about this conversation. We have supported Energy Peace Partners as part of the team that is looking at the PREC aggregation fund at the Innovation Lab, Climate Innovation Lab. And we are happy to see that this is actually a potential funding for mini grid developers in Africa. We have seen one of our mini grid developers already accessing this financing, and it's really exciting to see that this can be scaled up and also within the targeted countries that EEP is looking at. So I will start off my presentation, and my presentation will look at the financing landscape of mini grids in Africa. So focusing on decentralized mini grids in Africa, and I will go straight to AMDA and give you a brief overview of who AMDA is, and then we can have a more in-depth conversation about the financing landscape. So AMDA is an industry association of private sector mini grid developers who operate within rural Africa, and they operate, their businesses are really around electrifying rural households. Our vision is to ensure there is universal access to energy by 2030 using least cost, fastest technologies, as Olivia has alluded to. Our mission here is to help create an appropriate financing and policy framework that will enable radical scale of energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. So currently we've got 15, we operate in 15 countries, we've got 37 developers, and we've got 4 country coordination chapters, as you can see in the red, within the map. So we ideally operate within 3 pillars. So under the access to finance, we serve as the voice of the mini grid developers, and we promote growth and sustainable development. And the policy and regulation, we advocate for optimal policies that will benefit the mini grid sector and the people it serves. And the data and research, we provide a platform that enables transparency in industry performance. And we put out a lot of thought leadership and market data and analytics to then help policy makers in terms of decision making. So on to financing landscape that will scale up the mini grid development in Africa. I just want to step back and take a regional look at the mini grids space, and I will look at the SMAP $500 million report that was put out in 2019. And according to the World Bank report, in order to reach universal access by 2030, we will require 210,000 mini grids globally to connect around 490 million people at a cost of 220 billion. And as per the 2020 AMDA benchmarking report, there were 41,000 connections in 2019, connecting over 250,000 people, businesses, and communities with high quality productive energy. And in terms of what is being planned, so out of the 7,500 mini grids that are being planned, 4,000 are in Africa, and this will connect over 27 million people at an investment cost of 12 billion. So just to put into perspective, what is required to actually, have mini grids that have been planned, actually deployed. And just to continue developing the conversation around the funding in the mini grid space, the mini grid funders group actually puts out that 2 billion was committed. This is at last year in March 2020. And out of that 2 billion that was committed by the mini grid funders group, only 297 million, 13% of that has been disbursed to the mini grid space. And more than 50% of that disbursed funding went into technical assistance. When you're looking at this vis-a-vis, the larger scope of things, I think this is really, a really small allocation, right? And the developers in Africa have only received 50 million in concessional financing since 2013, which is really also, you've seen through the conversation and the slides that from C4All, just to give you a perspective of where the funding, how the funding looks like. So having said this, the current mini grid capital structure is really not your average capital structure, right? With equity, in the range of 100 to 80%, right? And debt only, being in the range of 20 to, in some projects, 0. So having said that, so you find that most mini grids are predominantly commercially funded through equity, with some of them up to 100%, as I've said, based on balance sheet structures, right? We've seen some non-recourse financing, in the recent 2 years, but predominantly speaking, the mini grid space is still, operating within the on-balance sheet structures. It could be because of the nascency of the market, but ideally we need to put in place, structures that will then scale up the space. And I'd really talk about that in my next slide. And having said that, mini grids require considerable grant support ranging from 40 to 70% of capex to ensure sustainability of the business model, and also to make sure that the rural end use tariffs are sustainable. In my opinion, I do not think that rural end consumers should bear the full cost of electrifying their households, and they should enjoy the same amount of subsidization that grid-tied utilities enjoy. So for mini grid developers have struggled to really attract long-term debt financing due to the following reasons. Key reasons are unpredictability of the tariffs. Tariffs are often subject to political influence. And you'll find in instances where there's cost reflective tariff, even within that regime, there's still the silent capping of tariffs, right? Then there's unpredictability of revenues. It's hard to predict cash flows from these rural households. Lack of policy and regulatory frameworks to support mini grid development. We find so many countries are still not able to have independent mini grid regulations. For countries with mini grid regulations, most of them do not have, are not regulations that can scale. So they still require you to have very site-specific licensing and regulatory approaches. Then there's lack of clarity on grid arrival rules and grid encroachment. It's in most regulations, it's really unclear as to what happens to the infrastructure development when the grid arrives. Projects get stuck in long and complex procurement and tariff negotiation processes, which really delays the process. Then there's lack of contractually based framework that allows allocation of risks and obligations between public sector and the private sector, and especially within the unsolicited proposal, where developers actually, go to the ground and find the sites and then go to the regulator, sign on a tariff and have a license to operate with the community. So there's actually, a need to move to a format that, allows for allocation of risks. That could be a good, fundamental or, framework for actually deploying risk mitigation products. Also, there's licensing requirements that are just long and not commensurate with the size of the installations. So incentive mechanisms and viability fund, gap funding for mini grids in Africa. So we are seeing two different, types of subsidies. So direct fiscal support and indirect fiscal support. So direct fiscal support could be through CapEx subsidies, OpEx subsidies, funding for productive use equipment. Also, we've got indirect fiscal support, technical assistance to, to developers, also tax exemptions. So rural mini grids are not viable without subsidization, and public grants or subsidies are needed to put mini grid projects on an economically sustainable footing, as I've said. And this can take these 2 formats. So the grants and subsidy programs are many. I will not go through this because of time. So I will move to just the role of public funding. And from the Benchmarking Africa Mini Grid report, we have seen that public funding has got a catalytic effect in terms of crowding in debt. And without it, we do not see investments coming in. To note is year 2016 and year 2017 on the graph, where we saw a growth in connection rates due to the public funding that came in those respective years. So key message here is just the need to have an integration of public funding to then be able to catalyze capital into the mini grid space. So the mini grid financiers, and what is interesting in this image is that there's very limited commercial financing, right? We can only see 2 commercial financiers in this diagram here that was in the State of the Global Mini Grid report that was published last year. And I would say, in terms of moving to a new frontier that will then scale up the market, I would wish to see more commercial and commercially financiers, offering debt and equity within this space. So the new financing structure that will scale up mini grids in Africa, in terms of debt, having long-term concessionary and commercial debt, having local currency financing. So here I'd like to stress the local banks and institutional investors and pension schemes being able to operate within this space. Non-recourse financing, also innovative asset financing, that then gives debt, and also convertible notes. In terms of guarantees and de-risking mechanisms here, I would like the sector to move to a place where there is, a robust political risk insurance framework, and also minimum revenue insurances to support, cash flow, forecasts for mini grid developers. In terms of climate finance, of course, the PREC, the subject of this conversation, falls within that space. The renewable energy credits also, and any other climate finance source, and especially within the voluntary carbon market mechanisms. In terms of other innovative financing models, here I'm looking at any aggregation methodologies that will then enable scale, securitization, and also blended finance vehicles. So I will stop there, and thank you so much for listening to me. I look forward to interacting with you in the chat box and also answering your questions at the end of this forum. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joan. That was very insightful. Maybe I could ask just a quick follow-up question for you, if you don't mind staying on camera. So one question that I have was just, you mentioned that public funding was really a main driver of some of the mini grid development. Do you see that continuing moving forward, the public financing or public funding being available? And also from the commercial financier standpoint, you highlighted that you would like to see more of those players enter into the space. What do you think are the trends on the commercial financier side? Do you see an expansion of those players entering in the market currently, or are there still some hurdles to bring more into the space?
So thank you so much for that question. I'll start with the first one. In terms of public funding and the space to expand that, going into the future, I think when you're looking at the mini grid space, just the nuances within this space, it's hard for you to have a conversation in terms of, having a cost reflective tariff and having the end rural consumer bear that tariff and the full cost of electrification without, talking about subsidy. So I think the conversation here needs to evolved to looking at the space in terms of, are we able to get a subsidy adjusted tariff that then allows, subsidies to be in place and, cost reflectivity on one hand and subsidy adjustment on the other hand, to be able to balance the willingness to pay and ability to pay of the end consumer and, a prudently incurred investment for the private sector. So I think it's really just our balancing act, but I think, public funding is really needed also to draw in, private capital, right? And a couple of years back, 2 years ago, we did actually a position paper that was really talking about the need for incentive mechanisms like the result-based financing, to be in place to then draw in private capital. On the second question, in terms of trends in commercial financiers, we are seeing in the recent past, we're seeing a lot of non-recourse financing coming into the space. And I think it's really a time for mini-grid developers to then move in that direction, to be able to access, number one, maybe higher ticket sizes due to the aggregation, and also to be able to attract long-term funding. What is currently there is short-term, mostly construction-based, debt financing. So there's really room, for the mini-grid space to grow.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I think now we'll turn to Sherwin Das from Energy Peace Partners, who will highlight the Peace Renewable Energy Credit and the work of EPP to help bring in more financing revenue streams into the mini-grid space in Africa and elsewhere globally. So Sherwin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Oren. Let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. Great, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Oren, for facilitating, and happy to be here with this distinguished panel. To connect some of the dots, I think Olivia and Joan pointed out some of the challenges in the space, and I hope I'll be able to talk through some of the opportunities and the specific solution that we have created. Oh. Forgive me here, I have some technical challenges.
Sherwin, if it's easier, I can also share from my side and we can run through.
Okay, let me try one more time. Okay, let me just scroll. Are you able to see?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. So let me just give an overview of Energy Peace Partners' vision and mission. We're an organization, and our vision is really a world with peace and stability, powered by renewable energy. The foundational idea behind Energy Peace Partners is that renewable energy can support peace and stability in fragile, conflict-affected states. Mission-wise, we leverage climate and finance solutions to promote peace in the world's most fragile regions. We do that in two ways. Firstly, making the case that renewable energy can contribute to supporting peace. And there are a couple of areas of work under that making the case framework. One, we support UN peacekeeping operations, which are deployed often in fragile, poorly electrified countries, make the transition to renewable energy as a way to introduce renewable energy infrastructure into these countries. And then two, we are working on developing a framework for measuring the peace and wider social impacts of renewable energy. So that's under making the case. The second thing that we do is we deploy innovative finance to support emerging renewable energy projects. What's the challenge? How do we articulate it? Our foundational research looked at fragile and conflict-affected states. We observed that many of these countries are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. In addition, we noticed that these same countries, or many of them, have extremely low levels of electrification. Put that another way, we can say the world's least electrified countries are also vulnerable to conflict and fragility and climate change. So on the map that you see on the right-hand side, you see 27 countries in red. Most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. There are a handful outside Africa. These are countries that are highly affected by fragility and conflict, very vulnerable to climate impacts, and some of the least electrified countries in the world. The population of all these countries is about a billion people. About a billion people are affected, but climate finance flows to these countries are extremely limited. The majority of climate finance is for renewable energy. In 2019, I think there was more than $300 billion in global renewable energy investment. Less than 5% went to Africa and the Middle East, and just a tiny fraction of that is going to the countries in red. So that is the problem. Limited and extremely low finance for renewable energy investment in these countries. Our solution to address this challenge is developing an innovative finance instrument called the Peace Renewable Energy Credit. The Peace Renewable Energy Credit is an unbundled energy attribute certificate where 1 megawatt hour is equivalent to one energy attribute certificate, or IREC. IRECs are the dominant energy attribute certificate tracking standard or platform outside North America and Europe. So a Peace Renewable Energy Credit is an unbundled IREC, meaning it's separated from the electricity that's sold, with a label from our organization, Energy Peace Partners, certifying the peace building or social impacts associated with that renewable energy generation. The value proposition of a Peace Renewable Energy Credit is that it extends this $1 billion plus voluntary energy attribute certificate market that many corporations participate in to fragile energy poor states, states like South Sudan and Chad and Somalia, some of the countries that Olivia alluded to in her opening presentation that have huge energy deficits, but very, very few finance flows into those countries for addressing the energy access challenge. PRECs create value for renewable energy generated in these countries, countries like DRC, and they offer developers working in these countries a new way to monetize renewable energy generation from their projects. PRECs provide entry points for corporates who are active in these voluntary REC markets to support high impact projects. Historically, you've had corporates that are more and more interested in impact and driving impact with their renewable energy procurement decisions, but there have been very few entry points to support high impact projects in fragile energy poor states. So we aim to provide those entry points for supporting projects. EPP's role technically is to certify Peace Renewable Energy Credit projects and to issue those PRECs. Currently, we're authorized by the IREC standard to issue Peace Renewable Energy Credits in 4 countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Chad, and Somalia. PRECs can benefit 3 constituencies. Going from left to right, they can benefit companies. Last year, Microsoft, and Vanessa, we're so happy to have her with us, we'll be talking about that. Microsoft purchased the first Peace Renewable Energy Credits to support their climate equity and sustainability goals. They purchased these PRECs from a developer, a Congolese solar developer, Nuru, who was able to take the revenue from the PREC sale and install public street lighting in a community as a result of that transaction. The streetlights were installed in a community outside of Goma, which is in eastern Congo, in a neighborhood called Ndosho, where 3% of the population has access to electricity. And they were installed in a commercial street where businesses had to shut down when it got dark, and there was considerable insecurity on the streets at night. And so we have seen, after the PREC funded streetlights were installed, that they have increased livelihood opportunities. They've allowed businesses to stay open longer. They've improved road safety and security for the residents, and they really have transformed that community. We've seen night markets open, and it's really made a huge difference. The second deal, the second PREC transaction, which was announced this year, was one in which Google forward purchased Peace Renewable Energy credits to support their responsible mining and sustainability goals. And these were purchased also from Congolese solar developer Nuru. It was, as I mentioned, an advance or forward sale, which helped to partially finance and construct 2 mini grids that were serving rural communities, the communities of Tadu and Faraje near Garamba National Park in DRC. Those 2 rural mini grids were commissioned this past June. And the mini grids are providing brand new first-time electrification to these rural communities that have never had any grid infrastructure. And because it's situated near Garamba National Park, these mini grids are offering real alternatives to the illicit poaching economy and to artisanal mining. Building on those 2 successfully executed PREC transactions, we are working closely with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and Joan alluded to this in her presentation, to launch the PREC Aggregation Fund. What the fund does, it allows developers to raise 10% of upfront capital for their new build projects through PREC forward sales. And on the corporate side, it allows companies to support a portfolio of projects. So unless they want to support specific projects, by supporting the fund, companies can support PREC projects across countries and regions. The PREC fund will be a $10 million fund made up of 50% grants, 50% concessional capital. We believe it can unlock about $90 million in high impact projects in Africa. And we're planning on launching this in late 2021 and early 2022. The fund would support almost 60 megawatts of new renewable energy projects. It would create approximately 10,000 jobs, facilitate household connections to more than 300,000 households, and avoid more than 600,000 metric tons of carbon emissions. It would support energy access, climate, and peace goals, the SDGs 7, 13, and 16. And in addition to the community and project impact that PREC projects would support through the fund, one of the important aspects is that it would serve to de-risk projects and increase the flow of capital and other lenders who would be willing to support projects in these markets. And both Joan and Olivia alluded to that, the lack of commercial capital. And so we see the PREC Aggregation Fund as a market-making mechanism, which would basically scale up transformation and attract more capital for renewable energy development in these markets. And I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Oren. Thanks.
Great, sure. And maybe just a quick question, quick follow-up that someone had, maybe if you take one minute here, but what kind of attribution claims can the corporates make off the back of these PREC purchases is a question that we had through the chat.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of motivations that companies have. We've seen increasing drives towards having impact with their renewable energy procurement decisions. So number one, we believe that purchasing PRECs can help companies meet their sustainability and renewable energy goals. And a lot of companies have, in addition, environmental and social commitments to, and I think Vanessa will speak to this, just energy transitions, impact, supporting new market development, supporting energy access. So it also helps them meet these other important targets. And I think as a global community, you've seen more and more corporates become involved in solving some of these global challenges which cross borders.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Appreciate that. So with that, we'll turn it over to Vanessa Myler-Fells from Microsoft. And Vanessa, I know you have some remarks that you've prepared, but it's, I think, quite an interesting journey that Microsoft's been on over the last few years. Certainly a leader in renewable energy procurement overall. And I think one thing that obviously Sherwin mentioned the PREC purchase that Microsoft executed, but I think also is important to note that the term climate equity appeared in your sustainability report, I believe, for the first time last year. So certainly we welcome you and your perspective on what's led Microsoft to begin to look at these types of projects. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Orin, and thank you, Sherwin, also for presenting the PREC project we did in Congo, or participated in Congo. I'm excited to discuss kind of novel ways to close the energy access gap here and what corporations like Microsoft or corporations that have set ambitious climate goals, like Sherwin mentioned, can do to bridge that energy access gap. We've seen huge leaps in technology that have helped progress in energy access goal, but as Olivia and everybody here on the panel have mentioned, financing remains one of the sector's biggest challenges. And it's pretty grounding to see both the progress in people connected to mini grids that has more than doubled over the last decade, but also the challenge that remain ahead of us with, you know, 3/4 of a billion people that would still lack energy access in 2030 with the existing and current planned policies. Just most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, as this is kind of the focus with the PREC right now. And so really, what can corporations do? There's many reasons why we're coming to the table. First, as you mentioned, Oren, we've been thinking a lot about, well, who are the population the most impacted by climate change? And typically the population that have contributed the least to climate change are the one the most impacted by climate change. So this is this notion of climate justice or climate equity to really rebalance so that the investment for climate adaptation and mitigation would go first and foremost to those that are the most impacted by climate change. The second piece is we're starting to look at not only our operational footprint, which for the most part is indeed in developed market, but also our value chain footprint. And if we think of our value chain footprint, it is obviously much more global, and it is at the source. If we think about mining or other industries that contribute to a value chain, it is much more global and much more located in emerging markets. So there is a reason for us to figure out new ways to invest in these markets. So when we first started looking at renewable energy, we set 100% renewable energy target by 2025, and then we have an even more ambitious target by 2030, which is to power 100% of our operation with 100% carbon-free electricity 100% of the time. These goals are extremely hard to achieve, but they will impact first and foremost the developed countries where we have operations. And so if you think of the corporate procurement trends, we've seen over the last 10 years, corporations globally have procured more than 100 gigawatt of renewables, but 60% of all corporate procurement of renewable energy has occurred in the US. And that's mainly due to where operations are located, but that's also due to favorable regulation, obviously, and the PPA economics in the US versus other geographies. And if we think of the number of companies that have joined, for example, RE100 or and pledged to power their operation with a certain percentage of renewable energy, corporations will continue to be one of the largest driver of clean energy built globally. But how can we just do more? So first, we're doing more on that front. We're investing, we've already invested 8 gigawatt of renewable energy globally since 2014. We announced just in July 6.2 gigawatt of PPAs that we executed over 8 countries around the world in 2021, making us the largest buyer of renewable energy in 2021, largest company in 2021. But we acknowledge that this is only focused on reducing our carbon footprint of our operation and strictly following the greenhouse gas protocol guidelines of Scope 2 and the market-based greenhouse gas accounting, where we seek first to decarbonize the grids where we operate. At the same time, as I've said, we know that the climate impact of any new renewable energy project depends on what it's displacing and where it's located. And it also impacts, as explained by Sherwin, the local communities in different ways. And so what if the climate investment that we do could reduce more than a company's carbon footprint? What if the smaller scale distributed renewable energy projects and providers could tap into the corporate demand for renewables? One area that we're trying to get more data onto is what is the carbon impact of projects in sub-Saharan Africa versus a project in the US? What is the energy that's being displaced? And there's a number of studies that are showing that community solar projects that displace diesel power generators can yield emissions reduction that are about 3 to 4 times bigger than a traditional corporate PPA in the US and in Europe. So we're talking, for a PPA in the US, displacing about 200 to 400 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour to more than 1,500 in sub-Saharan Africa. If we think about the climate impact and the cumulative, just the mathematics of CO2 being accumulated in the atmosphere, it makes sense to accelerate the decarbonization of the dirtiest grid. And this is really where the distributed RECs, and particularly the PRECs, can help us move the needle and really drive the investment in areas where it has the most benefit, not just for the climate, but also for the communities. And so that's why we really thought there was a great incentive to develop and support new really like a new mechanism. The PRECs is not a traditional REC. It needs a specific tracking system that Energy Peace Partner has set up. It is not a perfect fit for market-based greenhouse gas protocol accounting at this stage, as obviously it does not necessarily relate to investment where we have operations or where companies we're investing have operation, but it yields a great benefit that we need to be able to track and report. And so we were really excited to kind of work on this with Energy Peace Partner and also Sustainable Energy for All, the distributed REC initiative, to figure out how we can tap into the corporate procurement appetite for renewable energy and deliver more benefits to regions that are struggling to make the investment in renewable energy because of the cost and the financial barriers that were discussed. I won't present the project we've done with Energy Peace Partner, because I think you've already covered it very well, Sherwin, but we were very excited to be the first investing in a PREC in the Goma region, and it's been extremely just exciting to see the outcome of these street lights at night and the reports on the small businesses activity, the household, the quality of life that we've dramatically improved with a small investment for a company kind of perspective. So I'll stop here to make sure I leave at least 5 minutes for the Q&A session and answer any questions that you may have for any of the panelists.
Great, thank you, Vanessa, and we certainly welcome all the panelists to come back on screen if you don't mind, and we'll take this time to encourage folks in the audience, if you haven't already done so, please, if you have a question that you'd like to ask the panelists, you can input that in the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. So maybe, Vanessa, I'll just pick up on your comments and ask you about the trend of what we might call high impact procurement in the corporate space. So Sherwin highlighted obviously the Microsoft purchase and Google as well as transacted PRECs. Do you see these companies, maybe the forward-leaning tech companies, as this sort of exclusive folks who are pushing high impact, or do you see more corporates interested in these types of projects and an ability for it to become more standard practice over the coming years?
That's a great question. I think it's really tied to how we create the tools and mechanism and reporting mechanism from an accounting standpoint that allows for the scalability of these tools. Today, as I said, they're not a perfect fit for greenhouse gas protocol, market-based emissions. It would require basically companies only to invest where they operate, in the grids where they operate, and as most global corporations may have operations globally in these emerging markets, but have their concentration of their electricity purchases are in developed markets, it's a challenge. And so if we want to see this growing, if we want to see more corporations investing in a greater impact instrument, we have to make it much more scalable and much more traceable and tied back to existing accounting practices. So I'm very excited to kind of take that, in fact, and work with the different organizations to create the perfect mold, so then we can scale this.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate those remarks. So just to honor the questions that have come in here, I think we may have time for really a question that was asked earlier on. So this came from Wafa in the audience, and she says, regarding high conflict zones and countries in Africa, what are some ways in which we can shift the perception about investing in these places as risky, but rather necessary? Is there something that people on the ground can do to create reassurances for investors and funding sources? So I think I may open this up to any of the panelists who would like to jump in. I know, Joan, you probably have some thoughts about that, and Sherwin, perhaps you mentioned the aggregation fund as well that might relate to this question.
I can take a crack first, if that's okay. I mean, our experience was very interesting in developing the PREC. Initially, we were focused on United Nations humanitarian missions and peacekeeping missions. But because these are large bureaucracies, decision-making takes time. And so what we found in countries like South Sudan and Chad and DRC, that there are entrepreneurial commercial developers working on the ground. And because the economics of solar in particular are so strong in some of the most fragile and complex environments, there are renewable energy developers. And so I think that has been a promising development because of the economics of solar. And I think that is what is going to be driving development, and that is what has helped us to put companies like Nuru together with multinational companies like Microsoft. And I think that's that sort of that kind of local capacity building on its own is potentially the hook that can pull in multinational corporations.
Maybe just to add to what Sherwin has said, in terms of country risk, because there was another angle to that question, I guess there's really a big space for de-risking mechanisms within the mini-grid space. And here, I will talk about maybe the political risk insurance product that could be put in place specific for the mini-grid space to be able to take care of all these country level risks, political risks, which would be a good tool in terms of crowding in private sector investment and getting really investors on the ground. And I know some of our developers, and especially speaking of Nuru, have been some of the pioneering mini-grid developers who've been able to structure political risk insurance through the MIGA platform. And I guess it's really just a big space for developers to look at all those other options, and investors also to look at all those other options to be able to secure private sector investments.
Great, thank you. Well, Olivia, maybe since I haven't had a chance to ask you a question, we can wrap up here with just a straightforward question from, I think, Richa, who asked early on, why is only a tiny portion, I believe, of I think she referring to the global financial flows going to sort of US and Europe and not into these countries that were highlighted in your slides? Is it just politics or something else is the question?
Thanks, Owen. That's actually a really big question. And I think that some of the other panelists have gone some way in answering it. It's a lot about perception. And this ties back to the question about risk and perceived risk and what can be done about it. So I think Joan makes a very good point about political risk insurance. That's what that product is developed for. Sherwin also makes a really good point about this ecosystem that exists that's perhaps not as visible to us as it should be. So I think national governments can play a big role in setting the standard and setting the frameworks to sort of make investment environments more conducive to a larger range of investors. So good policy settings, good regulatory settings, a framework that's going to encourage long-term energy sector investment. So it's a really big question that we don't have time to answer today. Happy to take it offline, but there are sort of some things that can be done locally, but also some mechanisms to leverage internationally to get us there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I know certainly it feels like there's a larger conversation to explore here, and one that I think warrants a good bit more time. I am quite pleased to be able to have gathered today in this sort of unique topic and begin to explore different dimensions of it. I know from an Energy Peace Partners perspective, we hope to continue to have forums for these types of conversations and to continue to find ways to support new projects on the ground in places like sub-Saharan Africa and work with corporates as well. So hopefully, if folks have additional follow-up questions, the panelists would be available to provide their email, or we can direct questions to them in writing following the webinar. But otherwise, I think we're at time, so I'd like to wrap it up and say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the attendees of this webinar. It was recorded, so we will provide that following the conclusion of the webinar in the coming days. And we look forward to seeing you online again soon, and appreciate your interest in this topic. So thank you all.
Thank you.